July 31st, 2000. East St. Louis Police Department have just stumbled across the strangulated body of a woman right off of St. Clair Avenue. Instantly, it becomes clear this is nothing accidental. They have a case of murder on their hands. The victim, 61-year-old Mary Shields, a prostitute who often worked the stroll on St. Clair Avenue, just the area that she would be found at, dead. And unbeknownst to East St. Louis police at the time, this would be the first victim of a string of murders that would plague the area. This would be the first victim of the Bi-State Strangler. Fast forward to 2002, 2 years after the first murder, and the victims of the Bi-State Strangler have piled up. Out of these murders, 7 of them have been tied back to the same killer, those being 19-year-old Cassandra Walker, 34-year-old Alyssa Greenwade, 36-year-old Teresa Wilson, 46-year-old Betty James, 36-year-old Verona Thompson, 50-year-old Yvonne Cruz, and 33-year-old Brenda Beasley. Out of these confirmed victims, each and every one of them shared one main resemblance. They were all prostitutes. Around this time, investigators had already been trying to piece together this case, and this detail was definitely of help because it provided an insight into the killer's possible motive. Something else interesting that investigators had noticed while studying this case was that these murders started on July 31st of 2000, stopped between October 8th, 2001 and January 30th, 2002, then abruptly continued. This was odd behavior and led them to believe the possibility that the perpetrator could have been deployed by the military or even been incarcerated around this time. Many theories such as these were formed around the abrupt halt in the murders. However, none of them would bring investigators any closer into solving this mystery. In the midst of the investigation, a writer named Bill Smith, who worked human interest at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch building, decides to do a piece on Teresa Wilson, one of the victims of the Bi-State Strangler. The reason he is doing this piece is to bring light to the untimely death of this woman while also shedding light on this ongoing case. Unknowing to him at the time, what he was currently writing would play an immense role in putting this 2-year-long investigation to rest. couple days go by. At this point, the piece on Teresa Wilson had already been released in the Sunday paper. Bill receives a note at work. Receiving notes was not an uncommon occurrence for writers working the St. Louis Dispatch building. Quite often, readers would send in letters to writers regarding their work, whether that be to compliment it or to simply ask a question. So, just like every other note Bill had received in his career, he opens it up, expecting it to be from one of his fans. However, this time, it wasn't from one of his fans. It was from someone claiming to be the Bi-State Strangler himself. The note reads, "Dear Bill, nice sob story on Teresa Wilson. Write one about Greenwade. Write a good one, and I'll tell you where many others are to prove I'm real. Here's directions to number 17. Search in a 50-yard radius from the X. Put the story in the Sunday paper like the last." Accompanied by the note was a map that supposedly contained the location of what he claimed was Victim 17. Upon receival of this note, Bill instantly turned it into authorities. At first, authorities thought this was some kind of sick joke, but regardless, in the chance it was real, they decided to go and check out the location on the map. Once police arrived on the scene, they began to search in the wooded area where the X was on the map, and to their disbelief, they stumbled across the dismembered remains of a woman just feet from the road. This was undeniable proof that the letter actually had come from the killer himself. From this, investigators started scanning both the written notes and the map for clues. Eventually, they were able to deduce that the map was computer generated. This clue would give them their first real lead in over 2 years. In short time, investigators found the website that had been used to make the map, Expedia.com. From here, they contacted the owners of the site and requested IP logs of users who had recently input the coordinates to the location that was shown on the killer's map. Through this, they had found an IP that, in the past couple of days, had browsed over the location of the crime scene several times. This IP tied back to a man named Maury Travis. Investigators take a deeper look into this guy. Who is Maury Travis? They find out that Maury has had his fair share run-ins with the law. He's a convicted felon. At one point, even spending up to 5 years in prison. What's even more damning about this Maury Travis guy was that around the time the murder stopped, between October 8th, 2001 and January 30th, 2002, Maury was in incarceration on a drug charge. Everything checked out. So much so that police decide it's about time to pay Maury a visit. And with a search warrant in hand, that is exactly what they do. Police knock on his door. Surprisingly, he shows no resistance and opens it.
It is 7 in the morning.
You're right, it's 7 in the morning and we're serving you a federal search warrant.
Okay. Why are you here?
You know why we're here.
After this confrontation, police then show him the warrant and enter the residence. They search the first floor and see nothing out of the ordinary. The house seems to be well furnished and kept in outstanding shape. After clearing the whole first floor, they then decide to venture down into the basements. And what they would find down there would be enough to put Maury Troy Travis behind bars indefinitely. Bloodstains cover the room. They're on the couches, ceiling, and carpet. It's a horrific sight. Down the hallway, they find a bedroom. Inside this bedroom was Maury's computer. Upon analysis of the computer, police find drafts of the letter that had been sent to the Post Dispatch building. This was undeniable proof, enough to lock him up for good. However, the worst was yet to come, because what police would find next would be far more harrowing than anything they had already discovered. Stacked neatly on a shelf were tapes upon tapes. These tapes contained video recording of women being tortured, raped, and even killed, all at the hands of Maury Troy Travis. All at the hands of this monster. After this discovery, Maury Travis was apprehended and taken in for interrogation. Over the course of a couple of days, Maury would give up little to no information surrounding these murders. And just 3 days later, in a jail cell, he would hang himself, taking all his secrets with him. Now, let's focus our attention back to these tapes. These tapes are what classifies this case as lost media, because not a single one, at least in its entirety, has ever seen the light of day. Simply put, they are way too gruesome to be released to the public. All we have ever seen of them are a couple of snippets and audio clips from a tape labeled Your Wedding Day. Here are some excerpts from this tape.
Say it clear.
You are the master that pleases me to serve you. You are the master that pleases me to serve you.
Stop up.
You are the master that pleases me to serve you.
This is first kill number 1. First kill was 19 years old. Name, I don't know.
This is all we have of these tapes, and for the foreseeable future, all we are going to get. But lying in some back compartments, far away from public view, the tapes of Maury Troy Travis and his abhorrent crimes exist. It's a Friday, and students at Lowndes High School are beginning to flood into the building to start their day. Out of these students is a girl who we will call Amy. Just like any other ordinary day, Amy decides to head to her morning class in the gymnasium. Upon entering, she sees a group of her friends hanging out in the corner of the gymnasium, right next to where the wrestling mats were rolled up. So she decides to go over and talk with them. Whilst the group is conversing, out of the blue, Amy spots a pair of feet sticking out of one of the rolled up wrestling mats. Upon taking a closer look, the students get freaked out and call over a staff to check it out. Unbeknownst to them, inside the mat was the lifeless body of fellow peer Kendrick Johnson. When it was realized that the boy inside the mat was not responding or moving, the police were instantly notified.
From the lounge side's going out. There's a dead body out here.
Police arrive on scene around 10:35 a.m. and begin investigations. So, what happened to Kendrick Johnson? Was this an accident, or was there foul play at hand? Well, to begin, let's take a look at some of the details surrounding this case. Inside the mat was a black and white shoe, supposedly the reason Kendrick went inside the mat in the first place, given that he was trying to retrieve it. When Kendrick was found, he was in a pool of blood and vomit. This can most likely be attributed to him being stuck upside down for a prolonged period of time. However, this is where the peculiar part comes in. The black and white shoe, the one he had been reaching for, it was perfectly clean. Not a hint of blood or vomit graced its surface. Something else peculiar was that just above Kendrick, near his feet, were another pair of shoes, the ones that he had been wearing previously. These shoes were in a position that makes very little sense, given that Kendrick actually had fallen into the mat on his own. Additionally, the width of the opening in the mats was around 14 inches, and Kendrick's length from shoulder to shoulder was 19 inches. So it would have been extremely hard for him to slip into this opening on his own. Upon these revelations, this case started seeming less like an accidental death and more like a possible murder. When Kendrick's body was taken in for examination, it was found that his lungs were at a normal weight. If Kendrick had died from suffocation whilst being upside down, fluids would have built up in his lungs, making them much heavier. Despite this, and all the other discrepancies at the scene of his death, medical examiners concluded that there was no foul play at hand. And for officials, this would mark the end of this case. However, not everyone was satisfied with this answer.
If he was inside the mat, reaching for that shoe, inside this tube, reaching for the shoe, and the shoe is beneath him, why isn't that shoe covered with blood?
And what do you think about that shoe not being covered with blood?
It was placed there.
But Kendrick's parents say the photo and the video show something else.
There's enough evidence to show that Kendrick was murdered.
Kendrick's parents had seen all the evidence, and they were extremely skeptical that their son's death was accidental. So they decided to hire someone to do a private autopsy on the body. When examiners looked inside the boy's body, they realized that a lot of his organs, including his brain, were missing, with all of them being replaced by newspaper. Upon asking the funeral home where his organs were, they stated that they never received them in the first place. This was odd and only raised more red flags regarding the case. Once the second autopsy had finished, it was concluded that Kendrick had died from blunt force to the neck, which was a completely different answer from the first autopsy. Now more than ever, Kendrick's parents were sure that their son had been murdered. Yet, they couldn't do anything about it because this autopsy was done unofficially and the case had already been closed. To put it simply, they just didn't have enough evidence to justify the reopening of Kendrick's case. Now, there is one key detail that I have been purposely leaving out. One piece of evidence to be specific. A piece of evidence that, if Kendrick's parents could obtain, would put this case to rest forever. Inside Lowndes High School are a network system of cameras placed around the school, with some of these cameras even being in the gymnasium. If we take a look at the footage recorded on the day of Kendrick's disappearance, we can see him playing basketball in the gymnasium just moments before the incident would take place. And then abruptly, the footage ends. And a couple hours later, it starts back up. The footage that captured what happened to Kendrick on that day is missing. After this realization, the school released a statement claiming that the cameras malfunctioned around the time of the incident. Kendrick's parents and many others were not buying this. They believed that the footage filmed on the day of the incident had been tampered with, possibly even deleted. This piece of disturbing lost media is one of those rare cases that, if it does exist and it is found, would actually be good. Good in the sense that it could give us a definitive answer to what truly happened on that fateful day. Unfortunately though, it is almost certain that this footage will never be unearthed. And what truly happened to Kendrick Johnson on that day will remain a mystery. In the late 1990s, a man named Joshua Powell had just started college in Tacoma, Washington. Here is where he would meet the love of his life, Susan Cox. Josh would instantly show interest in her, and over time, the two would begin to spend day in and day out with each other. Their relationship was very strong, with little to no hiccups, so shortly after they had first met, Josh would propose, and 5 months later, the couple would get married. Following this, they would have 2 children together, Charles Powell and Braden Powell. On the surface, Josh and Susan Powell seemed to have the picture-perfect marriage, the white picket fence American dream. However, behind closed doors, this was far, far from the truth. Upon meeting Susan, Josh showed no signs out of the ordinary. Over time, however, he would become more and more controlling over her. A few examples of this was Josh would not let Susan use the family car without his permission. Additionally, he would not let Susan go out with friends that he hadn't met prior. However, this would be, in retrospect, comparatively nothing for what was to come. Just after Josh and Susan had gotten married, to save on money, the couple would move into Josh's parents' house. Here is where Susan would be first introduced to Josh's father, Stephen Powell.
That's Susan. There's Josh. Standing with her, but I really want her. I wish she would look my way. She was so pretty today when she came over to the house. She was so pretty today when she came over to the house.
In short time, Stephen would take a liking to Susan. This would eventually turn into an obsession with her. An obsession that, in time, would become outright disturbing. His obsession began with him taking videos of Susan without her knowledge. As Stephen became more obsessed, he would eventually start taking pairs of Susan's underwear out of her dresser. Susan, noticing multiple pieces of underwear missing, would over time begin to suspect that Stephen had been taking them. However, this never led anywhere. Something else that Stephen did was read through Susan's journal that she wrote in almost daily. In the journal, he would read about how Susan felt uncomfortable around him and how little she cared for him. This was very upsetting to him because, in his own delusion, he thought Susan had reciprocating feelings for him. One example of Stephen's delusions comes from a video log that he kept documenting his obsession to Susan.
I just had what is probably the most erotic experience I've had in my entire life. I hate to say it, I mean, of course, because I haven't had that many experiences, but Susan has been feeling ill. She had a cold, and I offered to rub her feet, to rub her toes, to give her some stimulation. That went on. I probably rubbed her feet. Her toes are beautiful feet. She has such pretty feet. Of course, everything about her is pretty, beautiful. And I know she felt it. She couldn't have missed it. She's not naive either, I know, from what I've read in her journals. That girl is not naive. When I started massaging her legs, I would have loved to go all the way up her legs, but I did do her calves, because her feet were resting in my crotch, so I sort of rubbed her calves. She didn't seem to mind at all having me that close. I mean, I was close. I was touching her with my crotch. Then I just started rubbing her back and her neck and her shoulders. I didn't want to push my luck. Josh was sitting across the room on the chair, and he wasn't always watching, so I sort of took liberties as he didn't watch, and I put my hands around the front, and I did feel her breasts, at least to some degree. I didn't put my hands, and I didn't cup my hands over them, but I felt the sides and a little bit on the underneath, and she had an underwire bra on, wow. And yeah. It's hard to remember everything I did. And I love that woman. She is so beautiful. I can't even get enough of her. Can't get enough of looking at her. She's so pretty. And I held her arm and I held her hand. I cupped her hand in mine, her beautiful little hands. And I rubbed her forearm and I massaged it all up and down, massaged it for a long time. I went up her sleeve. She didn't even mind. She seemed to enjoy it. I mean, I've slipped my hand up inside of her sleeve and I had it over here and I was massaging her shoulder blade and I was right here, just above her breast.
Stephen ended up letting this obsession take over his life. So much so that he would eventually write a love song about her that he would post on his website. Eventually, one day, whilst Stephen and Susan were alone in the car together, he would express his feelings toward her.
Totally wrong, but I've really fallen in love with you. And, I don't know, I mean, for the last year and a half, you're about the only thing we can think about. I don't know where it began. It probably began when you were living with me and you come into my office and, let me feel your legs smooth, relaxed, whatever, and then it just went from one thing to another. And, that experience on the couch, on your couch in Yakima 6 months ago was just, I know that, it was a massage, right? But just being with you for 2 hours and holding you, and maybe I'm getting the wrong signals from you. Maybe I'm interpreting something that I shouldn't be interpreting. It just, for example, when we were sitting on the couch, it just felt like you were very, I was extremely aroused, and I think you were somewhat aroused. At least I thought.
I don't know where you're going with this.
And Susan, I'll tell you what I'm
married to your son, and
Susan was super freaked out by this, freaked out by everything, and shortly after, her and Josh would move into their own house, far away from Stephen and his disturbing obsession. However, this would not be the end of Susan's torment. Upon moving into their new home, the couple would have their 2 children, Charles and Brandon Powell. Susan believed that having kids together would strengthen her and Josh's marriage. However, this was not the case. From here, Josh would only get worse and worse. In 2007, Josh would eventually file for bankruptcy due to racking up over $200,000 in debts. This debt was completely kept secret from Susan, and Josh claimed to her that it was all from student loans. Something else very odd that Josh would do is every time Susan would bring up Stephen's odd obsession with her, Josh would gaslight her and deny that any of it was real. On top of all this, the couple would frequently get into heated arguments, with many of these taking place in front of their own children. Because of these strainful living conditions, Susan began to feel more and more unsafe. In a video filmed by Susan Powell on July 29, 2008, we can observe that something feels off in her demeanor.
This is me, July 29th, 2008. It is 12:33 Mountain Time. Covering all my bases, making sure that if something happens to me or my family or all of us, that our assets are documented. Hope everything works out and we're all happy and live happily ever after as much as that's possible. Charlie, say hi.
In this video, Susan documents the family's assets. The most likely reason she filmed this video was out of fear for her and her children's safety. This can only be solidified harder when Susan stated,
covering all my bases, making sure that if something happens to me or my family or all of us, that our assets are documented.
At this point, it seemed like Susan was well aware that something very bad could possibly be looming over the horizon. And unfortunately for her, that is exactly what was happening.
Are police building a case against the husband of Susan Powell? I'm Karen Carlson.
I'm Robert Maxwell. They will not confirm that's happening, but ABC4 has learned that at least one criminal subpoena targets Josh Powell in the disappearance of his wife.
Early in the morning on a Monday, neighbors of the Powell family observed Joshua Powell, his two sons, and supposedly his wife leaving in the family car around 2 a.m. The family was going on what Josh would later call a midnight camping trip. However, the majority of people to this day believe this to be an alibi for what really went on. Regardless, the family would arrive back at their house around 5 p.m., this time without Susan. Over the course of this day, people in Susan's life would grow worried, given that she never showed up to work that day and nobody could get into contact with her. Through this worry came a police report, and on December 7th of 2009, Susan Powell was officially declared missing.
Did you have anything to do with the disappearance of your wife? No. Nothing.
In short time, Joshua Powell had found himself as the main suspect in this investigation, most likely due to neighbor testimonies and the midnight camping trip story not quite lining up. Josh had claimed that his camping trip took place at the Pony Express Trail in western Utah. So, authorities made their way over to the site. However, this would yield nothing. There was no sign of Susan Powell. Josh was eventually taken into the police station and interrogated about the disappearance of his wife. Josh claimed that Susan was at the house before they left on the camping trip, and when they had arrived home, she was missing. This is all interrogators would get out of Josh. Seeing as Josh was unwilling to talk, they decided to bring in his son, Charlie, for some questioning.
Oh, you, Charlie, are a big boy to wait for me. Thank you. Okay, so Charlie, when you guys came home from camping, who came home with you?
My dad.
And
my mom stayed at Dinosaur National Park.
Your mom stayed there?
Yeah.
Out of this, investigators learned that Susan indeed was on the camping trip with them, and as Josh's own son stated, never came home with them. At the time, this was all investigators had on Josh, so they had no choice but to release him for the time being. Meanwhile, authorities were looking into Josh's father, Stephen Powell. Sometime after the disappearance of Susan, Stephen began to publicly portray some odd behaviors. Odd enough that police eventually decided to raid his house in search of evidence that could help locate Susan. Inside Stephen's house, police would find explicit videos of Susan that were recorded without her knowledge. Additionally, when police searched Stephen's computer, they found files upon files of child. Despite all this incriminating material, there was nothing found relating to Susan's disappearance. Regardless, Stephen was arrested for voyeurism and possession of child and was sentenced to 5 years in jail. After the arrest of Stephen Powell, it was declared that Joshua was unfit to be a parent. So the custody of his 2 children were moved over to Susan's parents, Chuck and Jody Cox. Now, the only way Josh was able to see his kids was through supervised visitations that happened each Sunday. And it would be on one of these visitations that tragedy would strike. It's February 5th, 2012, and a social worker accompanied by Josh's children have just arrived at Josh's house for visitation. Josh opens the door and immediately rushes his kids into the house before locking the door on the social worker. The social worker, in extreme shock of what had just happened, makes a phone call to 911.
And this is the craziest thing. He looked right at me and closed the door. And I'd like to pull out of the driveway because I smell gasoline and he won't let me in. This could be life-threatening. He went to court on Wednesday and he didn't get his kids back. And this is really, I'm afraid for their lives.
At 12 p.m. on that fateful day, an explosion would go off inside of Josh's house, setting it ablaze, with him and his children inside of it. On that day, Joshua Powell took his and his own children's lives, subsequently taking the secret of what truly happened to Susan Powell to the grave. Autopsies report that upon rushing his kids inside and locking the door, Joshua gruesomely axed both of them in the head, killing them right there and then. As for Josh, he was engulfed in the flames from the explosion and would die shortly after. In the initial days of Susan's disappearance, Josh's brother Michael Powell would randomly dispose of a 1997 Ford Taurus to a wrecking yard. This information would only come to light years after the investigation had started. So, with Stephen Powell locked up in jail and Josh and his 2 kids being deceased, authorities turned to Michael Powell for answers. When asked about Susan's disappearance and the sudden disposal of a 1997 Ford Taurus, Michael gave up zero information. He was being extremely uncooperative, almost as if he was hiding something. After this interview, authorities realized it was useless trying to get information out of Michael, so this would be the last they would ever speak to him. Months go by, and out of the blue, authorities get some horrifying news. Michael Powell, the brother of Joshua Powell, had just jumped to his death off of a 7-story parking garage. Now Joshua, his 2 children, and his brother were dead, taking whatever information they had on Susan's disappearance to the grave. To this day, Susan's whereabouts are still unknown. This case remains unsolved, and with everyone involved being dead and almost all pieces of evidence being destroyed, a definitive explanation for what truly happened to Susan is highly unlikely. The chances are very slim, but not impossible. When Joshua's house went up in flames, authorities managed to recover his computer. Inside Josh's computer laid 5 hard drives. All 5 of these hard drives have been heavily encrypted, which indicates that there's something on them Josh did not want anyone seeing. Ever since the retrieval of these hard drives, 4 out of the 5 have been successfully decrypted, leaving the final and most heavily encrypted one of them all still up in the air. This is one of the most interesting cases of lost media I have ever come across in my time on the internet. I'd say this can be attributed to the power in which it holds. This hard drive, this piece of lost media, is so unbelievably significant because if it does ever get decrypted and the files on it get unearthed, it could put one of the most outright disturbing cases ever recorded to rest.